We're doing a study on the book of Job. We're calling it Triumphing Over Troubles. I hope you have your syllabus. We have this lesson number 5 that we're going to be dealing with today, called The Failure of Fickle Feelings. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to look at Job's 3 friends as they try to answer his problem. It's difficult to answer a problem you don't even understand, to answer questions you've not even heard. But that's what they're going to do because they assume that they have the answers. The failure of fickle feelings. This is the first of his friends that begins to speak. Now, I'll begin with this statement. Empathy is feeling someone else's pain in your heart. That's really what Job needs more than anybody else. Somebody that can feel his pain. See, what he needs desperately is not a theologian to give him another sermon. And oh my, I'm talking to myself here because having been a preacher all my life, I tend to do this. I get too preachy, too fast. And I'm trying to, preach a sermon on everything when sometimes all they need is a good hug. Somebody that just cares. Somebody that will just listen to them. That is not what he gets from his friends. Each of his friends make this mistake of believing there's some kind of a hidden sin in Job's life, and that's the reason that he's going through these problems. Now, regretfully, Job's friends are not the only one that believe that. Even Jesus' disciples had that theology. It's a common belief around the world that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. For instance, in the book of John, the 9th chapter, in verse 2 and 3, you find Jesus' disciples come to him. They've got a big theological question because there's a man that's born blind. And so his disciples ask him, Rabbi, who sinned? Boy, isn't that the first question we always ask? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered and said, neither this man nor his parents have sinned, but that the works of God could be revealed in him. Stop looking for the sin, for the problem. Start looking for a solution to the problem. That's the mistake that Job's friends make. And so there's 3 rounds of debate that takes place in this. And actually what happens, the friend speaks and then Job answers, and then the friend speaks and Job comes back and answers again. I'm going to approach it just dealing with the 3 friends and then his response and not do that in detail. We'll look at his response in full in a further lesson. There's 3 rounds of these debates, as I said, and each one of Job's friends try to prove and solve the problem, to answer the question in a different way. But they're all coming from their soulish man. I'll explain what I mean by that. The first one that speaks up is a man by the name of Eliphaz. Eliphaz is called the Temanite. That's where he come from, or his father. And so Eliphaz, the name literally means, my God has refined. And if any of his friends was a gentleman, Eliphaz was the gentleman. He speaks as the voice of philosophy. And he is very good at giving his philosophy on everything. So let me introduce you to him the way the book of Job does in chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. This is Eliphaz speaking. Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? And who can withhold himself from speaking? Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled. Is not your reverence, your confidence, and the integrity of your ways, your hope? Now, Eliphaz begins speaking first, and because of this, we believe he is the oldest of Job's friends. In that culture, they always permitted the eldest to speak first. And so we believe him to be the oldest. He is, as I said, the gentleman in the crowd. His accusations against Job are the mildest of the three. He approaches it by saying, if Job has sinned. Now, that's a very mild way of saying it, but it's still an accusation. Even though he's saying it, if he's done wrong, it's still implying that he has done wrong. Because of his theology, his philosophy is this man has got hidden sin in his life. Now, the thing about Eliphaz is many of the things that he says is true. But it's only partial truth. The problem is, it's his reasoning that is wrong. He's approaching it from the wrong basis. He's approaching solving Job's problems from his personal experiences. Now, we're always in trouble when we start trying to interpret life from our personal experiences. Yes, learn from your personal experiences. But understand life is bigger than you are. It's greater than your experiences. The problem for these men, they have never met anyone that has experienced what Job has experienced. They don't know of anyone that has experienced what he has experienced. And so when you limit God to your personal experiences, you're already in trouble. It's a mistake to try to limit God to our personal experiences, because God is greater than our personal experiences. He's bigger than we are. As I've stated before, some of the greatest revelations that I have discovered about God is he is not a U.S. citizen. He's not white. He doesn't speak English. He's above all of that. And I have to understand I cannot make God in my image. I should be being transformed into his image instead of thinking that God is like me. Now, looking at Eliphaz. Eliphaz begins to speak about a spiritual experience he has. It was evidently a pretty terrifying experience. It was very real to him. Here's the way that he says it. This is in Job, the 4th chapter, verses 13 through 15. Eliphaz says, in disquieting thoughts from the vision in the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear came upon me, and trembling, all which made all of my bones shake. Then a spirit passed before my face, and the hair on my body stood up. That sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? I mean, that sounds like some kind of terror movie that he's experiencing. Now, the problem is, we are made of spirit, soul, and body. What Eliphaz is attempting to do is to answer Job's questions from his soulish man. The soulish man consists also of three parts: our mind, our will, our emotions. And that's why I'm entitling this lesson, The Problem of Fickle Feelings, is because that is what he's trying to do, is answer Job's problem from his emotional experience. He's speaking out of emotion. Now, emotion is a great gift, or it's a terrible weapon. It depends on how you use it. Someone has said, emotions make wonderful servants, but terrible masters. Have you ever met someone that everything, they dramatized it? They made it bigger than it really was. They were just so emotional about it. That's Eliphaz. Eliphaz is talking about this experience that he had, a vision in the night, whatever it was, that a spirit that passed before him, and the hair stood up on his head. I mean, he said, I was in fear, trembling. All my bones were shaking, and no doubt it was very real. But what does that have to do with Job? What does that have to do with what Job is going through? See, he's trying to take his personal experience and solve Job's problems out of his emotions. It's impossible, because Job's problem is not an emotional problem. We've already saw in the book of Job, the real problem began in heaven at the throne of God when Satan is challenging God. That's where the real problem is. It's a spiritual problem, not a soulish problem, not an emotional problem. And so because his problem is a spiritual problem, you can't solve it with your emotions. That's the mistake that Eliphaz is making. Now, when you look at what emotion does, everything reproduces after its own kind. That's what emotions does. Emotions produce more emotions. See, this is the problem. I've seen a lot of Christians that they're always wanting God to give them a sign. And give me a sign that, like the story of Gideon, when he's wringing the water out of the sheepskin, and he's saying, God, give me a sign. If you're really going to use me, then let the dew fall on the sheepskin, or let the dew fall on the ground and the sheepskin be dry. Now, what's the problem with seeking after signs? All signs can produce is the need for more signs. Everything reproduces after its own kind, and so that's what's happening here. And so Job reacts to Eliphaz's false accusations like he's been stabbed. I mean, it's Job's emotions that arise, and he becomes very angry, and he responds to him, and this is the way he says it. Then you scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions, so that my soul chooses strangling and death rather than my body. Job is reacting to these accusations. Eliphaz is saying, you've got to have done something wrong. And it had nothing to do with Job. And so many times we try to give answers to people's problems when we don't even understand what they're going through, let alone have an answer for that problem. Now, here's the second round of debate. Because the first round, there was no conclusion, there was no answer. So Eliphaz comes back the second time. And in the second round of debate, Eliphaz repeats his mistake of talking about personal experiences. Now again, experiences are very special to us. They are our personal gift. But don't try to apply your personal experiences to everybody else's life. Listen to the words of Eliphaz. This is in Job, the 15th chapter, and verse 17. It's the second round of debates. I will tell you, hear me, and I will declare. What I have seen, I will declare. Again, he's going back to his personal experiences. And we're wrong to do this because God is greater than we are. I've just been amazed at some of the things that I have seen God do around the world. And yet I have to step back and I say, I know that's God working. I know that's God's Spirit, but I am amazed that God is working in this manner, in this way. When we limit God to our personal experiences, we're going to soon run out of anything to talk about. That's what Eliphaz does. And so what he does, he begins to repeat himself again and again because he's limiting God to personal experiences. That is a mistake. Do not make that mistake. Now, the third round of debate. The third round of debate, after Job is answered and give his rebuttal to these accusations against him, Eliphaz comes back the third time and he begins to argue with Job. Now, here's what I've discovered. When emotions cannot win the argument, anger begins to arise. That's what happens with Eliphaz. Now he has become angry. His emotions are going out of control. We end up raising our voice. We begin to make increasingly radical demands, just like Eliphaz does. In fact, notice what he does. He starts accusing Job of extortion, of robbery, of cruelty, of wickedness. Listen to some of his words. This is in Job, the 22nd chapter, verses 5 through 10. You have taken pledges from your brother for no reason. Extortion. You have stripped the naked of their clothing. Well, that's a big accusation. You have not given water to the weary to drink, and you have withheld bread from the hungry. He goes on to say, you have sent the widows away empty, and the strength of the fathers was crushed. Boy, those are powerful accusations. He said, therefore, this is why this has happened to you. This snare is all around you, and sudden fear troubles you. In other words, Job, you're getting what you deserve because of the way that you have treated others. The problem was, none of this was true. He could not prove anything that he is saying. He's simply speaking out of his anger. This is what they call the Mount St. Helena syndrome. I'm sure those of you from the western part of the United States know of Mount St. Helena, the famous volcano that blew its top. And they say what happens is the pressure keeps building and building, and there cannot be a release of the pressure, then it will explode. That's what anger does. And I've seen a lot of people use anger. They use anger to control others. They use anger to try to get their way. But every time you use anger in that manner, you're abusing it, you're blowing your top. And you're not going to create something good. You're simply going to cause a disaster. That's what's happening. Eliphaz is blowing his top. He's speaking out of anger. Be careful about that, because if you're not careful, you will end up like Eliphaz and God saying, you've got to repent. You are wrong. Eliphaz was wrong to do this. And the reason he did it goes back to this faulty theology. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. And since bad things have happened to Job, he must have been doing something that's bad. Anger is never going to solve our problems. It never has. It never will. All it does is end up hurting people even more. Be careful. The Bible warns us, be angry, but do not sin. In other words, when you become angry, you're on the verge of playing like God. The Bible tells us vengeance belongs to God. He will repay. But the moment that we cross that line, be careful, because when you become angry, you're getting close to playing like you are God. Poor Job. He's hurting worse now than he was before his friends came. He was attacked by the devil, and that was bad enough. But now his friends are there, falsely accusing him of doing all kinds of bad things. Instead of helping Job, they end up hurting him, attacking him. Instead of solving his problem, they make his problem worse. Now, what I'm saying to you is, be careful when you're trying to help someone. If you're not careful, you will start approaching it from the wrong basis. Job's problem was a spiritual problem. For spiritual problems, we must have spiritual answers. They're not giving spiritual answers. They're giving soulish answers. He's using his emotions to try to solve the problem. And he ends up calling Job a hypocrite and telling Job he needs to repent. He accuses him of all these terrible things. What's Eliphaz doing? Eliphaz is talking like the devil. The devil was the first one to call Job a hypocrite, and now Eliphaz, his friend, is calling him a hypocrite. Now, again, some of the things that Eliphaz says are good. It's not that it's all bad, everything that he said. For instance, these words of Eliphaz in Job 22 and verse 21. Now acquaint yourself with him, with God, and be at peace. Thereby good will come to you. Now, those are good words. There's nothing wrong with those words for somebody that needs to repent. But we know from the story, Job doesn't need to repent. In fact, God said about Job, Job had done nothing wrong. God's telling the truth. Eliphaz is not telling the truth. He is coming up with false assumptions because he thinks he has hidden sin in his life. And so instead of helping Job, Eliphaz is just making Job more angry. Oh, may God help us not to do this. I confess my own fault. Because I am such a highly passionate person, I've had to deal with anger all my life to get it right. Now, I know some people don't have to deal with anger. They're so passive that they make me angry, you know. Some people never get angry about anything, and I end up getting angry about that. You know, I'll quote them scriptures like in the book of Ephesians where he says, be angry and sin not. And that's a command. That's an imperative. He didn't give you a choice. He said that when God's angry about something, you ought to be angry about it. But be careful. When God's not angry, you must not be angry either. That's what got Moses in trouble. Now, here's some of the emotional mistakes that we make. We believe that man contains a divine spark in his soul that can solve his own problems. That's not true. Only God can help us solve these kinds of problems. It's a spiritual problem. Only God can help us do it. It's not going to come out of our soul, out of ourselves. So there's no divine spark here inside you that's going to solve it. Here's another mistake. We trust the merits of our personal suffering to make us better people. Now, I have seen some people go through problems and they become better people because they did the right things. I've seen other people go through problems and they become bitter people. They didn't become better, they became bitter. Their life was destroyed by their problems. So problems alone is not going to solve our problem. It's not going to make us a better person unless we do the right things. Here's the third mistake. We cannot use our emotions to distinguish between what is soulish and what is spiritual. Because we're trying to use the soul to determine what is soulish. It will deceive us every time. No, only the Spirit can help us to discern between what is soulish and what is spiritual. And then the fourth mistake I see that we make is we begin to mistake our emotional experiences for spiritual growth. That's what Eliphaz thinks. He thinks because he had this vision in the night and he saw this ghost-like spirit that passed before him, that made him more spiritual. No, he just had some kind of a nightmare. He just had some kind of experience that obviously he hasn't learned much from it because he's now trying to apply it to everybody else's life. God help us to understand that our emotions are too fickle to solve our problems. We're not going to be able to take the soulish man and solve the spiritual problems. So Eliphaz is wrong. He is wrong, and he will have to repent not only for the words that he's saying, but for what he's done against Job, and end up coming and bringing Job a very generous offering to make things right with his friend. God help us. I was raised in church where we allowed freedom of the expression of emotion. I thank God for that. I thank God for my heritage. See, some of the things that you do not despise the day of your beginnings. That's like despising your mother. Your mother gave you life. You wouldn't even be here without her. And so I thank God for those early beginnings in my life. But one of the mistakes that we made in our early Pentecostal experiences was we put too much emphasis on emotion. And we could not distinguish the difference between what was emotional and what was spiritual. It caused me a lot of problems as a young Christian. I struggled with this in a big way. And I thought I was a carnal person because I wasn't as emotional as some of my friends. My friends were much more emotional in their demonstration of their worship, and I equated that with spirituality. It wasn't spirituality. They were just more emotional than I was. And some of them, ended up disappointing me because they allowed emotions to control their life. So don't do that. Don't make the mistake of equating emotions with spirituality. Eliphaz thinks that he can solve Job's problems out of his own personal experiences. He could not, and we cannot. So be careful when you address someone that is hurting, that you don't hurt them even more and leave them in worse condition than you found them. That's what Eliphaz does, and because of this, he ends up having to repent. So may God help us in our Christian journey, as we all have to deal with problems, never to take this self-righteous attitude that I'm right and they're all wrong, so I'm going to fix your problem for you. If you're not careful, you will end up like Eliphaz, having to repent over some of the things that you say and do. May God help us to learn that only God can answer some of our problems. We need spiritual answers to spiritual problems if we're going to learn to triumph over our troubles.